Hey everyone, Reese here, and I want to tell you about something quite special from my collection today. You see, not only is the Oric Atmos quite a rare and unique computer in its own right, but this one has a really good story behind it as well. So I won this back in 2015 in a charity auction to benefit the Centre for Computing History, and if you haven't guessed already from the title and the thumbnail of this video, this was actually used as a prop in a TV show. And this always gets a lot of attention when I post about it on Twitter and Instagram, so I thought it was finally time to put a proper video together and tell its story. The IT Crowd was the brainchild of Graham Linehan, the man behind Father Ted.
Bye, Bishop Brennan. We love you.
It was broadcast on Channel 4 between 2006 and 2010 with a special in 2013, and revolved around the basement-dwelling IT department of Renham Industries, a fictional London-based company that does, well, I'm not actually sure what they do. The show was well known for its IT department set, and it was always fun trying to spot all of the obscure machines and references in the background. It's a real shame it was filmed in the days before HD. There's actually a tour of the set in a special called the IT Crowd Manual, where Graham points out some of the computers, including the Oric.
All the stuff that was donated to us by the Centre for Computer History in Cambridge. This drives nerds mental. They get very excited about this. I think this is pretty good too, an Oric. And there's the one I had when I was a kid, a Spectrum, a ZX Spectrum.
A lot of the props on the set were provided by a company called Pure Energy Multimedia, who work closely with the Centre for Computing History in Cambridge. It's worth giving the centre a shout out actually. They're a really excellent resource and focus on having stuff set up that visitors can actually play with. They're also a registered charity who are entirely funded by donations. I'll put some links down in the description so you can check them out. They have a really good YouTube channel as well. So I was idly browsing eBay one day and came across a listing by Pure Energy for a prop that was used on the show. I could have sworn I took some screenshots of the eBay listing at the time, but I can't find them now. Fortunately, it's still available on the Wayback Machine, albeit with some bits missing. Anyway, as you can see, they were donating 100% of the proceeds of the sale to the centre and had some pictures of the Oric on set. The listing says that it was there from season 3 onwards, and looking at some clips confirmed that was indeed the case.
So what happened?
According to the eBay listing, they also provided some other really interesting machines, like a very rare Altair 8800, an Acorn Atom PCB, Amstrad CPC 464, and some nice boxed items like a ZX Spectrum and an Astro Wars handheld game. So despite me knowing absolutely nothing about Orics and them not even knowing whether it worked, I stuck in a bid, and to cut a long story short, I won. It took them quite a while to sort out this certificate of authenticity for me, but I was quite insistent on having it, not because I plan on selling the computer at any point, but I just think it's a really cool thing to have with it and a really important part of the story. So on to the Oric itself. I actually knew so little about them that I thought they were French for years. To be fair, they did sell very well in France and still have a cult following over there. It's only relatively recently I discovered that they were British.
Oh, that is typical. Why has it done that?
There's plenty of info out there, and if you're interested, I'll probably put together a video covering the history of Oric at some point in the future. But to cut a long story short, Oric was a trading name of Tangerine Computer Systems and was used on their Oric 1, Atmos and Telestrat computers that they released in the early 1980s. The specs of these machines were all pretty similar, using the ubiquitous 6502 CPU that was also found in the Commodore PET VIC-20 and 64, the Apple II, the Atari 8-bit computer range, and the Atari 2600, Nintendo NES, and, the Tamagotchi as well, believe it or not. The Oric computers came with either 16K or 48K of RAM and ran a variant of Microsoft BASIC. The Oric 1's ROM was notoriously buggy and the keyboard widely considered one of the worst in existence, but thankfully Oric fixed both of these issues in the Atmos. I can't speak for the ROM as I haven't really used this computer all that much yet, but the keyboard really is excellent and has a reputation for being one of the best available on an 8-bit system. So let's pop this thing open and see what we can see inside. The first thing that immediately stands out is this Oric 1 label on the motherboard. Many of these early Atmos machines were actually repurposed Oric 1s. As the spec was otherwise identical, it was just a case of replacing the ROM chip with the Atmos version. The Oric outputs its sound through a built-in speaker. I temporarily removed this and tapped directly into the AY3-8910 sound chip to get some decent audio for my video captures, as you'll see later on. This chip was used in the Amstrad CPC, MSX and Spectrum, and a slightly upgraded version was used in the Atari ST, so it has great pedigree. Speaking of pedigree, here's that MOS 6502 CPU. This one's clocked at 1 MHz, and alongside it is the 6522 VIA, which interfaces it to the rest of the hardware. This area here, if you haven't guessed it already, is the 48K of RAM. Finally, above this is the Oric HCS 10017 ULA chip. This custom chip is mainly concerned with generating graphics and clocking the CPU, as well as having DMA capabilities so it can access the RAM directly. It's a pretty sophisticated chip actually, and it's what makes an Oric an Oric. As far as connectivity is concerned, the Atmos provides an RF modulator for connection to a TV, a TTL RGB video output for connection to a monitor, a tape interface for loading software from cassette, a printer port, and a proprietary expansion port. It's powered by a 9V positive tip barrel jack connector which feeds the voltage regulator. This is where I came up against my first challenge. I didn't have any suitable power supplies for this machine. I had to adapt a Nintendo Famicom power supply by stripping it down and reversing the polarity. Not a huge job, and it saved me having to buy a new PSU. Once I had a suitable power supply, I decided to test the voltage regulator. I don't have a current limiting supply for testing, but it's something I'm intending on getting in future, so I'm just going to have to risk it. We can see that the regulator is giving us a reading of around 3.9 volts, which is lower than the 5 volts I was expecting. On the input side, we're seeing around 9 volts as expected from the supply. The Oric uses a strange setup with a negative voltage regulator called an LM79. This actually generates negative 5 volts, which is converted back to the 5 volts required by the components. Why oh why Tangerine decided to go with this setup is beyond me, but anyway. The regulator in these is notorious for getting extremely hot and burning itself out, so I'm going to replace it with a Traco switching regulator. This is a more modern design that is not only much more stable, but up to 96% efficient as well, meaning it runs cool. It's pin compatible, so a drop-in replacement, and the original heatsink is no longer required. Unfortunately, I don't have one in my box of parts and have to order one in, so I'll move on for now and get back to it. When powering up the machine, I'm getting this black and white error screen, so the next thing to test will be the chips. It's a very simple test, but by touching the tops of the chips when the computer is on, we can feel whether any of them are hot to the touch, indicating a short circuit. You have to be careful as they can sometimes get hot enough to burn your fingers. As suspected, one of the RAM chips is extremely hot. Orics are notorious for RAM chip failures, and I just happen to have some compatible Samsung 4164s in stock which I bought for my IBM PC, so I'm going to socket the RAM and get those installed. Now the new RAM chips are safely in their sockets and my new regulator has arrived, so let's get that installed as well. Testing again, we can see that we're getting almost exactly 5 volts, where we had 3.9 before, so that seems much better. So now the machine is repaired, it's time to get it powered up and see what the Oric is all about. The Atmos didn't come with any cables, so to hook it up to my monitor I'm using a SCART cable from Retro Computer Shack. These are hand built in the UK and they do a range of cables which are all excellent quality. The Oric's video output is actually a bit too weak for a modern TV, so this cable has a built-in amplifier which is powered by the Oric's 9V power supply using these pass-through connectors. The Oric has some built-in sound effects that can be triggered from BASIC, and these are apparently a popular way to test whether things are working properly, so let's try typing them in and seeing what happens. Back in the day when this machine was new, it would have been connected to either a disc interface or, more commonly, a cassette player. I have a few cassette players that might work, but I don't have any Oric software on cassette, and besides, the interface is notoriously finicky, so I'm using this cable that I got from a site called Cool Novelties to connect it to my PC. That means I'm limited to software that was released on cassette, but using these TAP files and a converter I can get them converted to WAV format and play them like any other sound file. I just wanted to talk a little bit about how I managed to get these games to load, as it required some trial and error. I used the TAP to WAV utility to convert the TAP files into WAV audio files. Initially they didn't work at all, which I suspected was something to do with the volume based on the info I'd read online. It turns out that both VLC and Audacity failed to play the 4800Hz files properly, or at least in a way that the Oric was expecting, so I had to specify 11 kHz output. Then it was just a case of setting the volume to 95% and playing the files back in Audacity. I also went into my system settings and made sure everything else was muted to stop any notifications or other noises from interfering with the loading process. I'm using a public domain game here called Conveyor Belt, mainly because it's tiny and only takes about 20 seconds to load, so it's quite handy for testing things out. Something I saw mentioned a lot online was how important it is to try to prevent hum on the audio cables. Apparently a laptop running on battery power is the safest option. There's also an Android app called Tap Oric, but I couldn't get anything to load when trying it on my phone. It's definitely something I want to revisit soon though. As I have zero experience with Orics, I asked for some game recommendations on Twitter. I had 3 from 6502 Nerd, so I'll check those out first. First up is Xenon 1. Based on the name alone, I was expecting the Bitmap Brothers game from the Amiga and Atari ST, which is one of my all-time favourites. That's not what this is though. It's fun though, and it's pretty tough, and it looks like there's a bit of depth to it that I haven't discovered yet. Definitely one I'm going to revisit soon. The second recommendation was Hunchback. This is quite an interesting concept, like a platformer without the platforms, or maybe it has them later on and I didn't get that far. It's all about timing your jumps and is pretty unforgiving. It's a good challenge and graphically pretty nice. The third and final recommendation from 6502 Nerd was Ghost Gobbler, which is a Pac-Man clone. As you may or may not be aware, I notoriously suck at Pac-Man, and that's also true of this version. Some of these unofficial arcade clones from back in the day were actually really good, and this is no exception. I'm a big fan of the graphics on this one, and it plays really nicely. I'd rather play a game like this on a decent keyboard than a rubbish joystick, and the Auric definitely delivers in that department. So 3 really good recommendations there. I also had a bit of a back and forth with someone called Defence Force, who was really helpful in getting everything up and running. His website is definitely the authority on Auric info, so it's well worth checking out. He also has a YouTube channel with lots of great in-depth technical information about the Aurics, which I'll link below. He had quite a few game recommendations, and I'm still working through them at the time of filming. Xenon 1 came up again, which isn't surprising because it's genuinely a very good game, as we've seen. The game he presumably took his name from, Defence Force, unfortunately wouldn't work for me no matter what I tried. I'm going to keep at it though because it does genuinely look good. He also recommended Impossible Mission, which is actually a modern port of the Commodore 64 classic of the same name. The Atari ST version of this game was one of my absolute favourites as a kid, still is in fact, and although it seems a few things have been tweaked to make it run on the Auric, it certainly doesn't disappoint. The graphics and sound are a big step up from the other games I've seen so far. A really good interpretation of one of my favourite games, and I can highly recommend it. I thought I'd check out Manic Miner as well, just to see how that translated to the Auric. I'm a big fan of the BBC Micro version of this game. Unlike the previous game, this one is an old release from 1985. Well, if the graphics and music on the title screen is anything to go by, this should be good. And yes, the graphics are on par with other versions at the time, it's just as ridiculously difficult as it should be. The music was specifically arranged for the Auric and sounds really good as a result. A great port of a great game. As we've done a few platformers, an arcade game and a shooter, I thought we'd check out a couple of other genres. Another of Defence Force's recommendations was 3D Fungus. The title screen comes up while the tape is still loading, which is interesting, and it's the first one I've come across so far. At least it's an indication that something's happening. The game's in French, and I have to admit fungus isn't a word we learned in high school, so I had to look it up. Apparently it means fungus. This game seems to involve racing some kind of glider through the desert while keeping it between these flags. I'm not sure what that has to do with fungus, to be honest. Anyway, it's pretty simple, but challenging, and the 3D wireframe graphics are very nice. Speaking of 3D wireframe graphics, the final recommendation I'm going to look at is called Starter 3D. It's a good old-fashioned racing game. When I first fired this up, I couldn't get past the copy protection, but digging around a bit I found a cracked version on auric.org. Starter 3D certainly looks impressive, and the sound effects are great too, but it isn't half difficult. In fact, I managed to spin out on pretty much every single corner. I don't have the time to master it now, but it's another one that I'm going to revisit in the near future. I'm gradually documenting everything in my collection and all of the projects that I'm working on, so if you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, please hit the subscribe button. Also, if you did genuinely enjoy the video, I'd very much appreciate a thumbs up, and if you want to talk Auric or anything else to do with my collection or retro computing, I'll see you down in the comments. So until next time, thank you very much.
Like humans, computers have memories. Unlike humans, their memories shrink when they work. Functions like color, sound, and movement use up large amounts of memory, leaving little for you to use. The new Auric Atmos, however, takes these functions in its stride leaving lots of memory. So you can expand into advanced programming and sophisticated games. The new Auric Atmos 48K, the large memory that stays large.